There was a time when America felt wide open when kids rode in the back of pickups. Dad smoked at the dinner table, and no one thought twice about it. It wasn't a rebellion. It was just normal life. The air itself seemed lighter, full of possibility and gasoline, with laughter spilling out of every front yard. Summer days stretched endlessly, and freedom wasn't something people talked about. It was simply lived. Rules existed, sure, but they were more like friendly suggestions than lines you couldn't cross. In the 1960s, life moved slower and simpler. You could light a cigarette almost anywhere at a restaurant, in a hospital waiting room, even in an airplane cruising above the clouds. The smell of smoke was as common as the clinking of silverware or the hum of a jukebox. No one worried about second-hand anything. It was just part of life, like coffee and conversation. It wasn't considered dangerous. It was considered adult. Fathers smoked as they drove. Mothers smoked as they ironed shirts. And teachers puffed through their lunch breaks without a second thought. Cars told the same story. No seatbelts, no airbags, no warning labels, just steel, speed, and faith. Kids stood in the back seat, waving at truckers on the highway. Babies sat in laps instead of car seats, and everyone trusted that if you held on tight enough, you'd be fine. Helmets were optional, rules were flexible, and responsibility came from personal judgment, not government regulation. People believed in common sense, or at least they thought they did. It was a time when trust felt thicker in the air. Trust in neighbors, in products, in people themselves. There was a shared belief that individuals knew what was best for themselves and their families. You could barbecue on the sidewalk, burn leaves in the yard, and let your kids run across town until the streetlights came on. The freedom wasn't loud or defiant. It was quiet, ordinary, and deeply American. Of course, danger lived in that same space, quietly ignored. Smoky rooms hid warning signs. Cars without belts turned small mistakes into tragedies. But few talked about it then. The country was still basking in post-war confidence, too busy building a modern world to worry about the cracks beginning to show. It was a culture that prized freedom so deeply, it sometimes mistook risk for strength. Looking back, it's easy to see the innocence and the blindness that defined that time. There's a strange comfort in remembering it. Even knowing what we know now, the 1960s felt alive in ways today's world can only imagine. It was reckless, imperfect, and profoundly human. But freedom always comes with a price, and by the 1970s, America started realizing it. Doctors smoked in offices. Pilots lit up mid-flight. Even commercials said cigarettes made you cool. The haze of tobacco wasn't just in the air. It was woven into the fabric of daily American life. From classrooms to courtrooms, ashtrays were as common as coffee cups. A thin ribbon of smoke seemed to trail behind every handshake, every meeting, every dinner. The country didn't just tolerate smoking, it celebrated it. Television led the charge. A smiling cowboy held his cigarette like a badge of honor, promising rugged freedom in every puff. Movie stars made it glamorous. Bogart, Monroe, Dean, all with a cigarette between their fingers, half shrouded in mystery. Billboards towered over highways, plastered with images of elegance, rebellion, and charm. Even the doctor on the screen looked trustworthy in his white coat, recommending one brand over another with calm authority. The irony wasn't lost on history, but back then, it was just part of the show. Restaurants were foggy sanctuaries of conversation, where smoke drifted lazily above cups of coffee and slices of pie. In hospitals, ashtrays sat on waiting room tables. Teachers puffed during grading breaks. On airplanes, passengers smoked between meals at 30,000 feet, their cigarette tips glowing red against the dark cabin. The smell clung to everything: curtains, jackets, hair. No one complained. It was as much a part of American identity as apple pie and Sunday drives. What made it so powerful was how universal it was. The factory worker, the office executive, the The young mother, the high school senior, they all shared in the ritual. It was social currency, a common bond, a quiet moment to think. Cigarettes marked adulthood, sophistication, control. Lighting one was like saying, "I belong." Few questioned what it might be doing beneath the surface. Early warnings did appear, small voices in newspapers and obscure studies whispering about lung damage and cancer, but they were easily dismissed. Everything's bad for you, people joked, waving the smoke away. Tobacco companies pushed back hard, funding research that said otherwise. They knew how to shape doubt, how to sell confidence. For a while, they won. Then, in 1964, the tide shifted. The U.S. Surgeon General released a groundbreaking report linking smoking to lung cancer and heart disease. It was a quiet revolution, written in scientific terms, but its message cut deep. Slowly, Americans began to see the fog for what it was. The commercials didn't vanish overnight, nor did the habit, but the illusion of innocence began to fade. Still, for millions, the cigarette remained more than a vice. It was a memory. The flick of a lighter, the first inhale, the glow of the tip in the dark, it all carried a strange comfort. A habit born of an era that trusted too easily and questioned too little. But while the air filled with smoke, the roads told another story of danger America didn't yet see coming. In the 1960s, riding without a seatbelt wasn't reckless, it was normal. Kids stood on car seats, waving through open windows as the wind hit their faces, their hair whipping around in the warm summer air. Families packed into big, gleaming station wagons, bench seats in the front. No restraints, no worries. Parents drove with one hand on the wheel and the other reaching back to keep a child from tumbling forward during a sudden stop. It wasn't seen as dangerous. It was simply the rhythm of family life on the open road. Cars back then were made of solid metal, heavy as tanks, and people trusted that weight to protect them. Safety wasn't a selling point. Style was. Tail fins, chrome, and horsepower ruled the market, and seatbelts were seen as unnecessary add-ons. Many buyers even asked dealerships to remove them, believing they looked too clinical, too fearful. A true American driver, they thought, didn't need a strap to tell him how to survive. Kids played in the back, trading baseball cards, climbing over the seats, or lying flat on the rear window shelf like it was a sunny hammock. No one thought twice about it. Road trips stretched for miles, and the only rule was, don't fight. Parents smoked. The radio hummed with rock and roll, and everyone just assumed they'd get there safely. The car wasn't just transportation. It was freedom in motion, a private world on wheels where caution took a back seat to comfort. When safety advocates started raising alarms, most Americans rolled their eyes. Early campaigns showing crash test dummies or statistics about fatalities were met with laughter or irritation. People saw them as overreactions to government interference in something as personal as driving. Freedom over fear, the culture insisted. Restraint wasn't a virtue. It was an insult to your own confidence. Wearing a seatbelt meant admitting you didn't trust yourself or your car. But behind the pride and chrome, tragedy was quietly reshaping that mindset. Car accidents climbed as vehicles became faster and highways stretched longer. Families began to lose loved ones in crashes that might have been survivable. By the mid-1960s, the data became impossible to ignore. The federal government finally stepped in, urging manufacturers to include seatbelts as standard equipment and encouraging drivers to use them. Still, compliance was slow. Many tucked the belts under the seat, untouched and unwanted, long after the laws were written. Looking back, it's almost shocking to imagine the kind of risk accepted so casually. But that was the soul of the era, innocent, defiant, and certain that bad things only happened to someone else. For a nation still learning to balance liberty with safety, the open road was both a playground and a proving ground. And while families cruised unbuckled through life, another invisible risk grew louder in the driver's hand. Your dad cracking open a beer while driving wasn't shocking. It was Saturday. The sound of a can popping open blended right in with the hum of the engine and the soft crackle of the AM radio. Maybe he was driving the family to the lake or cruising down a back road after mowing the lawn. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't even secretive. It was just what people did. In the 1960s, drinking behind the wheel wasn't a scandal. It was tradition wrapped in the language of freedom. Beer rode shotgun across America. Cans sat casually in cup holders, back when they were called ashtrays. A driver might sip between beers, while his wife passed him another from the cooler on the passenger floor. No one blinked an eye. As long as the driver could talk straight and keep the car between the lines, the law usually looked the other way. It was an unspoken rule. Drink responsibly, not necessarily sober. The culture reinforced it at every turn. Beer commercials showed smiling men in convertibles, raising a toast after a long drive. Even print ads suggested that a cold one could make the road feel friendlier. "You've earned it," the slogan said. No disclaimers, no fine print. The same ads that celebrated family barbecues also celebrated the man behind the wheel. In those days, alcohol symbolized leisure, control, and confidence, all the qualities Americans prided themselves on. Police officers, too, operated within that same cultural fog. Unless someone was visibly staggering or weaving dangerously, most were sent home with a warning. Breathalyzers were primitive, and enforcement was often based on judgment rather than science. Drunk driving wasn't seen as a crime. It was an unfortunate mistake. News reports of fatal crashes made headlines, but they were treated like tragedies, not cautionary tales. For every family that mourned, 1,000 others went on believing they were careful enough, skilled enough, lucky enough to avoid disaster. But change was coming. The 1970s brought new research, louder advocacy, and heartbreaking stories that could no longer be ignored. Grassroots movements, led mostly by mothers who had lost children to drunk drivers, began demanding accountability. They spoke not in statistics, but in sorrow. Their organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MADD, gave a voice to grief and turned it into reform. Slowly, the culture shifted. Open container laws appeared. Penalties grew harsher. The image of the manly driver with a beer in hand faded into something darker, something unacceptable. Yet for many who lived through that time, the memory lingers of a world where freedom and danger shared the same seat. There was a strange innocence to it, born from a trust that people could police themselves. But the road, like freedom itself, has limits. Every turn carries a lesson, and every law written in its aftermath tells a story about how far we once went to prove we didn't need them. But alcohol wasn't the only thing blurring the lines. Freedom itself was under review. Kids shot BB guns, played with fireworks, and swam unsupervised, and somehow, most of them made it home by dinner. The 1960s backyard was a small universe of chaos and freedom, a place where scraped knees and singed eyebrows were proof of a good day. Parents watched from kitchen windows or didn't watch at all, trusting that their kids would figure things out. And somehow they did. The neighborhood itself was the playground, and every fence, tree, and creek was fair game. Summer afternoons rang with the metallic snap of BB guns hitting soda cans lined up on a fence. Firecrackers fizzed dangerously close to bare hands, and no one ever thought of calling the fire department. Kids rode bikes without helmets, barefoot and fearless, racing down gravel driveways with only a prayer and a scab waiting at the bottom. Danger was just part of the fun. It wasn't about breaking rules. It was about testing yourself, about learning the limits of your own bravery. There were no safety labels, no age restrictions, and very few warnings. Chemistry sets came with real acids and powders that could stain your hands for days. Lawn darts sharp enough to pierce the ground were family entertainment. Even swimming was an act of trust. Backyard pools had no fences, no floaties, no lifeguards. Parents told kids not to run, and that was about it. You learned to swim by being tossed in, and you learned to respect danger by meeting it face first. It sounds reckless now, but back then, it was seen as a kind of strength training for life. Parents believed that small risks built tough kids. A few bruises and tears were lessons, not emergencies. There was a quiet pride in self-reliance, knowing how to fix your bike chain, climb a tree, or build a campfire without help. Childhood wasn't padded or protected. It was raw, loud, and unpredictable. Contrast that with today, when playgrounds are made of soft foam and every toy is tested, labeled, and approved. Back then, adventure came unfiltered. The sounds of summer were laughter, shouts, and the crack of a firecracker echoing down the street. And when the day finally ended, the kids returned home, dirty, tired, and happy. Dinner tasted better after danger. It is easy to look back and wince at how unsafe it all was, but it is just as easy to smile at how alive it felt. That wild freedom forged the kind of courage the world doesn't make much anymore. The bruises faded, but the lessons didn't. The 1960s backyard was more than a patch of grass. It was where imagination met risk, and where childhood was truly free. But the wildness didn't stop at home. It extended all the way to the skies. Smoking cabins, free cocktails. No TSA, no bag checks. Flying in the 60s wasn't travel. It was luxury with zero rules. Airports were calm, quiet places where families could walk right up to the gate, wave goodbye, and watch the plane take off without ever flashing an ID. The world felt smaller then, and flying was something special, almost romantic. People dressed up for it, men in suits and ties, women in pearls and gloves. Every trip was an event, not a chore. Inside the cabin, it was a world of smoke and silver trays. Cigarettes burned freely in every row, their soft trails blending with the hum of the engines. Smoking or non-smoking was the only question asked, though the air was thick enough that it didn't really matter. Flight attendants, known then as stewardesses, moved gracefully through the aisles, balancing trays of martinis and ashtrays with practiced ease. They were icons of glamour, trained to smile through turbulence and to represent a fantasy of effortless sophistication. There were no long security lines, no metal detectors, and no one worried about taking off their shoes. You could show up 15 minutes before a flight, pay in cash, and be in the air before anyone asked your name. Baggage handlers didn't scan your suitcase. They just tossed it into the hold. The idea of danger in the sky barely existed, at least in the public imagination. Flying was a symbol of trust in technology, in strangers, and the idea that the world itself was safe to explore. Yet beneath the elegance, there were cracks. Air travel was far less regulated, and safety standards were still developing. Turbulence could send drinks flying. Cabins weren't pressurized like they are today, and seatbelts were optional. Some pilots even smoked in the cockpit. The skies were a new frontier, bold, glamorous, but unpredictable. Then came the hijackings. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, a wave of skyjacking shook the illusion of safety. Planes were diverted mid-air, often for political reasons, and what had once felt carefree suddenly felt fragile. The government responded with tighter rules, new technology, and the first serious security measures at airports. Slowly, the golden glow of air travel dimmed. By the end of the decade, the glamour gave way to caution. The stewardess became the flight attendant. Smoking sections shrank, then vanished entirely. The carefree days of walking onto a plane with a lighter in your pocket and a drink in your hand were gone, replaced by scanners, protocols, and long lines. Flying was still remarkable, but no longer magical. Still, for those who remember, that era in the skies feels almost unreal now. A time when the clouds seemed closer and freedom felt infinite until the world learned it couldn't be. And as the sky got safer, the neighborhoods below began to quiet down in another way. Lawnmowers roared, kids screamed, cars backfired, and nobody called the cops. In 1960s America, noise wasn't a nuisance. It was life. The hum of suburbia had its own soundtrack. Engines rumbling, radios blaring, screen doors slamming. Saturday mornings meant the growl of mowers and the rhythmic clank of sprinklers, while the smell of cut grass drifted across freshly built neighborhoods. It wasn't considered chaos. It was community. Every house had a noise, and every family contributed to the symphony. Kids shouted in the streets, playing tag until the sun disappeared. Neighbors gathered in driveways, laughing over barbecue smoke and ice-cold beer, while someone's Chevy idled a little too long out front. Fireworks popped in the distance, dogs barked back, and the air buzzed with a kind of easy acceptance. No one thought about decibel levels or noise ordinances. A loud neighborhood meant a lively one. If a car rumbled too loud down the block, people didn't complain. They looked to see what kind of engine it had. If a teenager's band practiced in the garage, the neighbors might roll their eyes, but they'd still wave the next morning. Everyone shared space, and that shared noise was part of belonging. There was a sense that freedom made sound and silence felt lonely. But as the years passed, the hum softened. The 1980s brought bigger houses, higher fences, and quieter streets. People moved from front porches to back patios, from sidewalks to private yards. The sound of the community gave way to the quiet of air conditioning and closed windows. The rise of noise complaints, zoning laws, and suburban ordinances didn't just hush the engines, it reshaped the culture. The once loud world of neighbors and shared moments became a quieter, more private one. Noise became something to regulate instead of something to live with. And in that silence, something subtle was lost. The sense that life was happening all around you, not just behind your own door. Still, for those who grew up then, the echoes linger. The distant crack of fireworks, the laughter spilling from a backyard, the chorus of mowers signaling the start of summer. It was a noise born from connection, not disturbance. A sound that said, "We're all here." But as the country got quieter, something else got louder. By the 1980s, America started adding rules for everything from seatbelts to smoking, from booze to bikes. The same nation that once prided itself on rugged independence was now learning a new language: regulation. It wasn't rebellion anymore to light a cigarette in an office. It was illegal. The highways that once roared with open cans and open windows now came with fines, checkpoints, and slogans about safety. Click it or ticket. Friends don't let friends drive drunk. The carefree pulse of the 60s began to fade under flashing hazard lights and public service announcements. The change didn't come overnight. It started with a few voices, people like Ralph Nader, who called out the dangers hidden beneath chrome and freedom. His book, Unsafe at Any Speed, cracked open a conversation America had long avoided. Maybe freedom without limits could kill. By the mid-1970s, consumer protection became a movement. Congress formed agencies. Warning labels appeared on everything from hair dryers to lawn darts. The message was clear. Risk was no longer a personal choice. It was a public concern. For the first time, the government wasn't just advising people. It was stepping in to save them from themselves. Smoking bans spread from hospitals to restaurants. Child safety seats became mandatory. Drinking ages rose. Helmets appeared on heads that once felt the rush of open wind. It was the dawn of the safety era, built on data, lawsuits, and lessons learned too late. But for many, it felt like something deeper was being regulated by the spirit of trust that once defined everyday life. There was a time when neighbors watched each other's kids without forms or background checks, when a handshake could close a deal, when common sense was seen as protection enough. Now, every choice comes with fine print. The word freedom still meant something, but it was a freedom fenced in by warnings and penalties. The divide grew between those who saw progress in protection and those who saw overreach in caution. America had traded a kind of wild innocence for something safer, smarter, and quieter. Yet, even as it became harder to get hurt, it also became harder to feel as free. By the late 1980s, every rule had a reason, and every reason had a story written in someone's loss. The system had learned, but the people remembered. The sound of seatbelts clicking and lighters snapping shut became the soundtrack of a new kind of America. Responsible, careful, and maybe a little less alive. Yet even as laws changed the landscape, the memories stayed locked in black and white photos and fading home movies. The 1960s are gone, but their spirit still lingers in old cars, vintage ads, and the stories our parents tell. You can almost hear it, the rumble of an unbuckled ride down a two-lane highway, the clink of a beer can on the dashboard, the soft hum of a cigarette burning beneath a dashboard glow. It was a time when the world felt looser, lighter, and somehow more alive. Before the labels and the rules, before the warnings and the lawsuits, there was a trust that life would work itself out and that a little danger was just part of being human. Those days weren't perfect. They carried their share of tragedy, of lessons paid for in blood and regret. But they were also the reason we learned to be safer, kinder, and more cautious. Every law written later was born from a story that started in those years, a story of someone who believed nothing bad could happen until it did. That balance between freedom and consequence shaped a generation, even if they didn't see it at the time. Now, decades later, the world looks back with mixed emotions. We know better, but we also miss what we lost. The thrill of riding in the back of a truck, hair whipping in the wind. The smell of smoke in a diner booth where strangers talked for hours. The sound of laughter echoing down a neighborhood street long after dark. It wasn't safe, but it was real. And maybe that's what nostalgia really is, a longing for when the world felt open, before it was measured and monitored. Progress made us careful. It made us live longer. But it also made us remember. The 1960s remind us that freedom has a texture, a sound, a feeling, and once you've known it, you can never quite let it go. The people who lived it carry that spark inside them still, even if their children and grandchildren only see it through faded photos or hear it in half-remembered stories. Maybe the lesson isn't to go back, but to remember without judgment, to understand that both freedom and safety have their place. One gives life its spark. The other makes sure it lasts. Somewhere in between them lies the America everyone was chasing. Daring, imperfect, but beautifully alive. If you remember a time when life felt freer, even if it was riskier, share your memory below. Let's keep the 1960s spirit alive.